Good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for coming in on this cold Monday night to listen to me have a chat to you for best part of an hour, I think. And a new subject tonight, not one that I've shared with you before. This is really an expansion of a lecture I delivered at a WFA conference that was held a few years ago at Brasenose College, where, of course, Douglas Haig studied as a student there, and was very pleased to deliver this lecture in front of Haig's painting in Brasenose College. But at that stage, it was a week in the life of the chief, and it was only 30 minutes long. So what we've done, we've expanded it out to make it the month, to look at September 1917, a fascinating month to study. And I should say straight away that what I'm not intending to do here is that any of you that have got your own views on Douglas Haig and have decided that's the way it is, that's fine. I'm not here to try and change them. I'm trying to put across how it is my opinion that one of Haig's greatest assets, and certainly by this stage of the war, is not so much just about being a battlefield commander, but how he manages all the other elements that were involved in running the British Expeditionary Force and effectively being the go-between from Westminster, Whitehall, the Western Front, his commanders, and the allies that surrounded him. And I think some of the things you might see tonight, looking at some of his own papers and some of the own comments or things that are written about him, it might give you a quite an intriguing view as to how Haig behaves during this time. The first thing we should do is we'll move on to the next slide, and we'll look at the timeline of the Western Front as it was in 1917. Very interesting. Of course, it starts with the Germans withdrawing back to the Hindenburg line from the Somme area back through Bapaume. As we know, this was a scorched earth policy where there were delayed action bombs. They poisoned waterholes. They chopped the trees down to block roads. Big holes through major thoroughfares they dug to really slow us down. And slowly but surely the BEF had to remain in contact with the enemy, so they would follow up. It's a very careful business, a very methodical business, and a very dangerous business. And by the time we get ourselves to late March, early April, we start to realize that we're actually coming up in front of what we now know as the Hindenburg Line, this massive pre-constructed defensive position the Germans had been building for most of the winter before, using forced labor, local labor, prisoners, and of course their own engineers. Very, very good use of the ground, and really quite an awe-inspiring objective for the Allies to be looking over. So the first thing that we really get engaged in here is the Battle of Arras. This was the first opportunity to use our new tactics and technology that had come from the Somme, things like the Grey 6 fuse, whatever. It starts off very successfully. As we know, the first opening gambits of that are very successful indeed. But like many of the Western Front campaigns, it ends up being ended up in a bit of stalemate. And it's not helped, of course, by this being partly a diversionary attack for the larger Nivelle offensive that was happening to the south with the French. That Nivelle offensive pushes through regardless of casualties, and has a real impact on the French mentality and morale as a result. There's no let up in the proactive stance that the British are taking. We're already planning for the Ypres salient offensive at this stage. We've got the Hush Hush scheme, which is something I really do enjoy studying and talking about. We have the German attack on the Belgian coast, Operation Strandfest, and sure enough, we have probably the most successful part of 1917 for the BF, which means the Battle of Messines, as we know, throughout the June. And that just enables us to start our main offensives in the up towards the north in the Ypres salient area. And then on the 31st of July, as we know, we launch the third Battle of Ypres, and that rages from the 31st of July with various stops leading through to September, which is the month that we're obviously going to be looking at today. So what were the key issues that impacted on Douglas Haig in the September of 1917 outside of the Western Front itself? Well, it's fair to say one of the most important ones here was still command of the seas. On the top right there of that screen, you can see those shaded lines. They are the German unrestricted warfare zones. Any shipping within those shaded lines are legitimate targets for the Germans. This is something that had come about from the February of 1917, initially hugely successful. About 25% of every ship that is sailing towards the UK is sunk during this period, and so it causes real concern for us. We do actually amend that slightly. By the time we get to May, we've introduced a convoy system, and that reduces those losses down to around about 500,000 tons per month. That's an awful lot still, and that improves even further. By the time we get to September, we're still at 300,000 tons of shipping losses each month. That's going to have material impact on Haig's ability to operate on the Western Front. So it's continually getting updates and reports of how that's going. The next thing he's concerned about is the strength of the Allies around him. France has been badly affected by the Nouvelle offensive, as we know. Whether they are capable of launching joint offensives, we're not quite sure at this stage. Italy, things aren't going so well down in Italy as well, and we're seeing the first cracks there. Remember, in November is when we see the Battle of Caporetto that really impacts on it. But even by September, we see a build-up of Austrian activity on that front and concerns from the Italians, certainly when it comes to having the capability of artillery, which is something they're crying out for. And also the USA. America is now in the war, as we know, joined in the April. But how quick is it? How quick is that race for the Americans to get from the US onto the Western Front to make a material difference? Well, I should say, I spoke about the Hindenburg Line only last night, and we should give great credit for the Americans. The speed that they raise an army and get it into the field is roughly half the time it took the British to do it in 1914. And we're very complimentary about ourselves for that, so credit due to them. The real concern for him is actually what's happening in Russia. And you can see in the center there, that sort of image of those Russian soldiers, because on the 9th of September, we see the end of what we know as the Kornilov affair. This was one of the Russian army commanders that had decided to get a military coup together to try and counter the Bolshevik threat that he could see. The whole of the operation failed. And what that means is by the 14th of September, Russia actually declares of it, parts of Russia declare itself as a republic. This has a direct impact again on Haig. He references it a number of times, and there'll be one incident that we'll talk about shortly that will prove that it was certainly on his mind. There's political pressure as well. It's coming from Whitehall, it's coming from the corridors of power in Westminster, but nowhere more is that expressed than we get to perhaps the low point in Haig's personal time as a commander, which is on the 25th September, where the Boulogne conference goes ahead without him knowing it's even taking place. And we're certainly going to delve down into that during this talk. And the other thing I should mention here is that all at this time, we are maintaining the offensive in the Presalient. It's very important that we maintain the pressure on. We're still working to the timetable that we wanted to get up to Passchendaele Ridge and beyond. And at this time, as a result of the Boulogne conference, what happens is we actually extend our line, take on around about 30 miles of extra front line from the French. One of the things I did want to discuss with us was really this myth of a Chateau General that I'm amazed it still exists in the to the degree that it does. I mean, there are seriously people out there that you still read in some magazines and things that Haig literally had his foot up in some massive chateau with a huge staff around him, pandering to his every need. And just to kind of make the point that I don't think that's always the case, I wanted to take one day in particular before we go back to the start of the month. And that day, I've been a bit subjective because I admit I've picked a busy day, but nevertheless, I want you to look at what occurs on this day. This is the 17th of September, 1917. It starts as every day does. very early for Haig. He's usually woken by his orderly, certainly before sunrise, where he's brought his mail. He'll usually come down to breakfast, where he'll process that mail. Then he'll go for a walk around the garden to clear his head before his first meetings start. On this morning, he decides in the morning that he's going to go on individual visits to the every corps headquarters in the Second Army. This will involve meeting all the corps commanders, and then including the divisional commanders and the divisional artillery officers of each of the divisions in those corps. Each of those being personal meetings, and the objective of these meetings is actually to study the plans for the attack, and also to analyse any of the battery plans, the counter battery plans that they are looking to encounter during this action. If we look at those corps, that's 3 different corps in particular: Morland's 10 Corps, Hamilton Gordon's 11 Corps, and of course Birdwood's in the Anzac Corps. And Haig writes, "In every case, I found the officers full of confidence. Every detail had been gone into most thoroughly. I felt it most exhilarating to be around such a very knowledgeable and confident body of leaders." So he writes that at the time he's very confident in what his leaders are about to, his commanders are about to achieve for him. That takes up most of his day. He then motors by motorcade back towards the coast, and by 4:30 he's at a place called Berwick near Ayr, and there he's actually looking at the trial of 2 narrow gauge railway trucks. These are a new innovation. He was always keen to see these latest weapons, or even engineering assets, or whatever they would be that would assist him in his war effort. And he comments that they were really designed for carrying heavy artillery. The trials were quite successful, and it's my intention to use these trucks for the rapid transfer of heavy artillery from one battle to the other, to another. So he's even looking down at the level of these trucks, having had all those meetings in the morning. Back in his car, back to his headquarters, which wasn't a huge chateau as you'd think it was. It was actually it was certainly a nice place to live, but it wasn't quite as huge as you'd think. That's not really what he wanted. But there that evening, he has dinner with Herbert Asquith, who's across, and Asquith says he was very struck by the confidence that he'd come across from the army from top to bottom, very complimentary of Haig. And Haig reflects that back when he says, "I feel that he is head and shoulders above any other politician who has ever visited my headquarters." That's quite a glowing tribute of Asquith from Haig there. In total that day, bearing in mind this is 1917, not today, where you'd be able to nip around it in an Uber in about 2.5 hours, he's done 140 kilometres. The next day, the 18th, he repeats the same thing, looking at Fifth Army. So just on those 2 days, you're talking at least 300 kilometers. You're talking multiple meetings, and you're talking looking at technology. And what have I done today? I've hardly managed to show you a PowerPoint without breaking it. So just bear that in mind, what these guys have got going on. The next thing we're going to move on to then is the first week of September 1917, between the 1st and the 7th. And here we see that Haig starts the month with an assessment in his diary of the Ypres fight as it had gone so far. And he shows here, I think, the indications that this is very much an attritional campaign. And when he writes, "Since the attack on July the 31st, we have captured 10,697 prisoners, 38 guns, 208 machine guns, and 73 trench mortars. Since the beginning of the battle, 41 German divisions have been engaged on the Ypres front, which over 30 have had to be withdrawn to refit. During the same period, we have engaged 23 divisions and withdrawn 13. He seems almost fixated in those statistics of how many Germans we are tying down in the Ypres salient, and the destructive nature of the campaign on their morale and their ability to fight. He also goes at long ends to describe how many of those divisions have been brought up away from the French, as if we're doing our bit to take the pressure off of the French down in the Champagne region. He's called back to London on the 4th. And he goes back to Whitehall, Westminster and Whitehall, to meet both his military and his political counterparts there. And this is over a very quickly called conference. And it's about discussing the sending of heavy guns to Italy, to the Italian front. They were desperate for artillery. Of course, we wanted every gun we could get. And there was suddenly this idea that France and the UK, the British, were going to send guns down to Italy. What he comments there is quite interesting. He says the Prime Minister was very anxious that some guns should be sent. Bonar-Law was, as usual, very weak. Carson and General Smuts were opposed to any guns going whatsoever. Lord Cecil from the Foreign Office disassociated himself from everything that the Prime Minister said. And finally, it was agreed that the matter should be put back in my hands. Lloyd George took me to one side, spoke to me alone, and said it was very desirable to help the Italians in his question because the French were trying to supplant them in their affections. So most people would assume that actually Douglas Haig's job was to stand in his headquarters, poring over maps and looking at every single element of the Ypres offences is going on. It doesn't take you too long on Wikipedia or Google to search the Ypres battlefield, where it will talk about the Passchendaele battle being Haig did this, Haig didn't do that, it didn't fail because Haig didn't do this. Very few of them say actually for 3 days of it, Haig was in London acting as the politician, making decisions about what gun should be sent where and why. Once that decision was put back in his hand, he actually made contact with Kigel, General Kigel in France, and said, look, is there any way we're going to be able to find 50 French guns in our sector that we might be able to release alongside 50 of our own? And the reason he did this was because Foch turns up in London at the same time, and effectively Foch says that, oh, I've got 100 guns sat in idle on my front, so I can send them to Italy, no problem. So I think Haig is able to see actually there is a political power play being going on here, and maybe I should find the compromise. And as it was, we start to send 50 of those guns down towards Italy, probably 50 guns that we could have done with for ourselves. By the 7th of September, he's turning back to his interest in what's happening at Ypres. He's back in France, and he's also discussing what he sees as an operational matter that he's not overly convinced with. Here he's starting to be concerned about the small attacks that you can see are being launched on farms and isolated strongholds, strong points. This is certainly happening in Gough's 5th Army front. And so he makes a note to say that he's decided to stop Gough from going on with these little attacks, as he sees them. So we move on to the second week, which is between the 5th and the 8th and the 15th of September. And it starts off with Haig actually deciding to contact Gough directly and say, you've got to stop having these attacks. He starts to get a bit of advice as why is Gough doing this, and what's being fed back to him is that some of Gough's subordinate officers are perhaps not always being truthful in their opinion with what they're capable of doing when speaking to Hubert Gough himself. So they're almost saying, well, you know, I think we'll be able to do it, sir, just give us a chance, when to other people they're saying, don't think we're going to be able to do this. So that's when he decides to try and step in, and he says, first what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and visit a corps commander. It's one that he knows quite intimately. It's 5 Corps, and it's General Fanshawe. Of course, the two of them had got on quite well. Fanshawe had been an artillery officer to General Lomax on the Menin Road back in October 1914, and they spend some time talking about how the battle went at first Ypres and the battle they're facing now and the differences in that. Haig certainly says, you know, if anyone knows this ground, it's Fanshawe, so I'll listen to his advice. Fanshawe feeds back to him that he really doesn't feel that the divisions that were going to be used were up to these forthcoming small-scale attacks that have been planned. So on the back of that, Haig then rushes off to meet with Gough and Rawlinson, and over dinner he asked the question quite bluntly, were these attacks necessary for the success of the main attack? And if not, they should not go ahead. So that's quite to the case here. You know, if these aren't the main effort, why are we doing them? They're costly in materials, they're costly in manpower, and they're costly in morale. So perhaps we just stop doing these small scale attacks. He also finds time that day to go and visit Ivor Maxey, who's at 18 Corps headquarters, and there they actually sit down and discuss a battalion level action, because Haig is intrigued by how the platoons operated, and certainly where some gas shells dropped short, it appears to be that 9 casualties due to the gas that were caused by these gas shells dropping short were one of the reasons why the attack wasn't a total success, whereas across the rest of the battalion front, they suffered only 3 casualties. Now, that's only a little vignette, but I find that fascinating that we've gone for making decisions in the corridors of power of London about whether guns go to Italy, which you could say is strategical, to making decisions about whether Gough should be sending divisions in to attack certain strong points, which is certainly operational, down to looking at a report post-battalion at a tactical level of what went wrong and why. And I think that shows the broad range of leadership that he showed he was interested in. By the 12th of September, he's pleased that Gough reports back to him saying that I've decided to call off any further small-scale attacks prior to the main operation. So he shows he can be quite manipulative as well and convince his commanders what they're going to say before they do it. Maybe he should have been a civil servant. So the small-scale attacks stop. Now, that's one rare bit of good news, because the bad news is the fact that they are getting reports of disturbances in Etaples. Now, most of us remember this through that program, The Monocle Mutineer, about 20 odd years ago, or whatever it was. But there were there was certainly an outbreak of disorder at Etaples around this time. Haig says that he put it down to men in new drafts with revolutionary ideas. He actually says that they produced red flags and refused to obey orders. Sound like Charlton supporters to me. What they did was the ringleaders were arrested, and the participants active participants were then moved on to units serving in the front line. So it's quite an interesting way that he directly correlates what's occurring at ETAPS with what's happening in Russia, when you look at other accounts of the Etaples disturbance, it was more about the rigid training regime and some of the permanent staff's behaviour as opposed to revolutionary ideas. So somewhere along the line, one of those is right, one of those is wrong. He's also got to do his charming bit as the commander-in-chief, and one of the people that visits him for dinner on the 13th of September is Horatio Bottomley. What a fantastic name. Horatio Bottomley is actually the editor of John Ball magazine, and they have a very patriotic lunch, and Haig is impressed by how patriotic Horatio Bottomley is. Now, I believe his actual career doesn't end too well for him. It's in a bit of scandal later on. A day later, on the 14th, and I love this bit, Winston Churchill arrives. So there's no shortage of people turning up. Churchill, whilst he visits for a chat in the early afternoon, is keen to go back to his old stomping ground of Messines, of course, where he'd served as a battalion commander. Haig comments a lovely little line in his diary that says, we got to Messines and the enemy started to shell the hill with a few 5.9s. Winston ran back down the hill in such a hurry that he forgot his hat. So I really do quite like that account there. Moving on to the third week of the month now, the 16th to the 23rd of September. And again, Asquith has come to stay with him. And he makes that comment once more. I feel the old gentleman is head and shoulders above any other politician with regards to brains and all-round knowledge. So very, very popular in Haig's mind. He also has a very important with that chap you can see there on the left of the screen. That's General Trenchard. Trenchard is now greatly concerned about the amount of aircraft available to him over the Western Front. Haig wants to press the War Office for more aircraft because he can see as it is we're about 25 squadrons short. A lot of this is obviously protecting London and the southeast from airship go-to-bomber raids, but he feels that the aircraft are needed on the Western Front. So it shows that he's got ability to also consider all of the tools in his toolbox, including the air war, which is quite important. After lunch there, he after General Trenchard's met him, he motors off to look at some quarries near to Boulogne, where he's interested and he comments, we have 8,000 workmen producing 47 tons a month of rubble for road repairs. We pay the French £1.75 per ton for our stone. When we first started, it was only 3 francs, and it all goes back into the French roads. They really are a race of insurers. So quite an interesting comment there, but few people would realise that Haig's job he felt it was his job to go and look at stuff as simple as the road making. How were these roads being made? Were we getting the best out of the roads that we were using, and also the rubble that we were digging to construct for them? And then the picture you see on the right there, that's Lord Derby, and he met Lord Derby that evening, where they had a convivial discussion over what the political situation was like at home. Haig was beginning to feel the pinch, so wanted a bit of an eyes-on about, what did Lloyd George have in plan for him? How did he compare with Asquith? Who held the power? That sort of thing. They also had a chat about forming an Allied General Staff. They talked about the discipline issues following what was happening in Russia, and what they could also see had happened at ETAPS. And also they discussed what they thought the capabilities were of the French army. Were they able to take on any form of offensive should we need them to? So again, Haig is at this stage looking not only at his own army, but who can do what on either flank. So a pretty busy month so far. It's only going to get busier for him as we go into the last week of the month. We'll go from the 23rd through to the 30th of September. Actually, we'll just cross over into the 1st of October. By now, the main effort is underway in the Ypres salient, there's no doubt. And so Haig really does focus down into that as his main area of operation. He's a regular visitor to both Plumer and Goff. A few years ago, I was very lucky to be invited to, as part of the Sandhurst Trust, when they uncovered Haig's maps. And these were things that had been sat in Duxford in a cupboard for ages, and no one really knew what they were. The Imperial Museum, that was obviously on their inventory, but hadn't really been looked at. So the Sandhurst Trust said, do you mind if we restore these and have a look at them and then display them at Sandhurst? And they were absolutely incredible. Each of these maps you could pull out and you could walk on, and they would cover an area about the size of a penalty box for different parts of the Western Front. And actually what made them very impressive to me was that they, on his own maps, they'd taken off each contour layer and built it up and built it up. So it gave you a 3D map effect. And actually when we got to the Belgian coast, they dug it down and dug it down. So it actually went down under the sea and gave you sea level as well. Really impressive stuff. And the one I remember most of all was the map for the Menin Road, which would be the one that Haig would be using at this time, the one that he would be briefing both his army commanders, Plumer and Goff. And you could see Haig's fingerprint almost onto Gheluvelt Plateau, where he touched it that many times. This is the key to each salient. This is what we need. This is the key. This is the key. So he was very keen to impress his ideas across where he could, and then stand back and see see how they would go ahead with fighting their campaign. He reports rather concerningly, however, about the casualty levels. He says the Germans have had really high casualties, almost 20,000. Well, our casualties are very slight indeed. The 5th Army 7,000 and the 2nd Army less. Well, if we're conservatively less and we say 5,000 for the 2nd Army, then that's still, 13,000 casualties. We're back to the idea that Haig is under no illusion. This is an attritional front here up in the Ypres salient. And right in the middle of this very important busy week here, we see the Boulogne Conference, and we're going to go to that in a short while because it's very important and is worthy of further detail. The good news for Douglas Haig and the BF is that this is the week that the weather improves quite significantly in the Ypres salient, and on the back of that, so does the battle performances. What we see is the creeping barrages are starting to take a real impact, certainly along the Menin Road. That Battle of the Menin Road Ridge that was fought by the Anzac Corps at the time, where they're able to advance behind a creeping barrage through to Polygon Wood and leap their way up towards the battlefield. What it actually did, we don't often mention it enough really when we consider it, because we focus on the mud and the attrition. It actually gave us a view from Gheluvelt Plateau down over towards some of the German lines. It was as important a ground then as it had been in 1914, and certainly as important as it was going to be a year later in September 1918, when actually the main Allied thrust comes from Oosterburn Wood across, as opposed to up the Menin Road, so across directly from the Messines area. And once we get that view, it does withdraw the German artillery back because a lot of their battery positions are now within view of our observers. That might not have a material difference if you're a soldier in a frontline trench at Passchendaele as you go into the wettest, coldest, miserable months where you're literally occupying ground that has been destroyed by the artillery, standing in what was a swampy morass, like the photograph you can see in the middle there, almost a moonscape, as 9.2-inch howitzers like we see here just plough the whole area up. But where it did make a difference is the rear areas behind the Ypres salient were suddenly just out of range of some of those German guns. So life when you were out of the line became a lot more preferable than it had been up until that point in September. And that's an important thing to mention. That's counteracted by the fact that the German air activity is greater, so you're more likely to be bombed when you're behind the line from the air than you would have been a few months earlier. I have to say that, though. By the time we get to the end of the month, he actually holds a conference on the 28th of September, and it's here that I think somewhat prematurely Haig says to many of the staff that are present that he feels the Germans are now on the brink of collapse. As we know, just 10 days later, the Ypres salient fighting takes another turn, and that's certainly not the case. So a little bit premature there. So let's move on to that Boulogne conference itself. And this is the quote he gives here. A great bombshell arrived in the shape of a letter from the Chief of the Imperial General Staff stating that the British government had agreed in principle to take over more line from the French. This was settled at a conference on the 25th September at Boulogne, at which I was not present. Robertson comes out badly out of this, in my opinion, especially as it was definitely stated that no discussion on operations on the Western Front would be held with the French without me being present. Now, if you imagine you're the overall commander, and then you find out after the event that this meeting has taken place, it really is a real kick in the teeth to him. And I think it also very much undermines his command to a degree. As there is a degree of political manoeuvring going on in making this decision. You could, if you were generous, say that, well, actually, perhaps Haig's place was to be focusing on the Ypres salient fighting as opposed to a conference. But remember, Haig's job was to command the whole of the BF on the Western Front, not just to command those troops that were fighting at Ypres. You know, Horn's First Army down near Lens are asking for things all the way through this period: more ammunition, more artillery. Can we have reliefs? Can we have certain training? And then we have the Somme sector, and now we learn that we've taken on even more front from the French at short notice. What was the actual outcome of that conference? Let's see what it is that we took over. Well, firstly, as I mentioned before, he wasn't present, and he doesn't learn of its outcomes for over a week. Secondly, he discovers when he's there that there had been an agreement in principle to take over an extra 30 kilometers, not miles, I should say, of that line. That 30 miles of that line was certainly not very well prepared at the stage as well. When he was asked to report on how he felt about this, Haig says that he didn't think the French army were incapable of resisting a German attack, really. So before they hand over, perhaps what we're going to have to do is put the whole of our line onto a defensive footing. The report that he put forward was actually sidelined by Lloyd George. Lloyd George said, no, we are actually going to be focusing most of our efforts away from the Western Front, actually, and fighting the Ottoman Empire elsewhere on the globe still. So there's still this Easterners and Westerners front. It doesn't end when we leave Gallipoli. It's going on for a little bit further yet. Lloyd George has by this stage brought in Sir John French again back into the scene in an advisory capacity, and also William Robertson. And both these decisions, Robertson comes out of the war very well, and I'm certainly not going to start a campaign against him, but both these decisions to almost have them as confidants of Lloyd George is going to further alienate Haig and question his command somewhat. And then the real kick, really, though he offered up those 50 guns, there's far more than that goes to Italy. And in fact, he's going to lose a corps and quite a few, 2 corps, in fact, and quite a few divisions, including Fanshawe, who's going to be heading out there. But some of his divisions that he had as his reserve that would have come useful in use, certainly use at the Battle of Cambrai, find themselves in Italy by we get to the end of the year. What it means overall as a result of this conference is that BEF certainly switches from an offensive to a defensive position by the time we enter the winter. And that's not what Haig had in mind when he started this month on the 1st of September. Now, some of you, hopefully, if you have been out to see those images, and again, I apologize, the technology has not worked, so you see it in its entirety. What you can see of them may have noticed that they're not the same old images of Haig that you've come across time and time again. And this is one of the reasons really that I was able to be in a position to give this talk, is because my wife, NHS worker, and has been for most of the time that I've known her in her working life. And when I first say this would be the mid-90s, when she was working in operating theatres, she had a habit of, as patients were coming through for operations, she would just check to see, were they born between 1896, 1895 and 1900? If so, when they were coming around in recovery, just quiz them a bit, you know, had they involved in the Great War? And if so, what did they do? And it was incredible the amount of times that this worked. They would respond to this. They wanted to talk about the war, and then she'd say, would you mind if my husband came and spoke to you, and give them a card or whatever. And one guy in particular really came up trumps here. This was a chap who was an army photographer, and he said, I'd love you to come round. I went round. It was a very simple operation he'd had, a cataract operation, and so his sight had been saved, that sort of thing. I went round to see him, and he actually said, I've got something you might like here. I was an army photographer and I kept a batch of photographs. I went to a big conference. I went to lots of conferences, but I took these ones, and they were never used because every photograph is slightly blurred. But they might be of use to you if you'd like them, because when I looked at them more recently, I realized I recognized one of the guys on there as Douglas Haig. And so here I inherited around about a dozen images of Haig on army stationery paper that weren't actually submitted for any use by the press, because every one of them was slightly blurred. So I started to do a bit more research into them, and if we look at the image you've got on the screen there, you can see One Moment in Time. You'll notice the date there is the 5th of April 1919. It perhaps shows you the issues with relying just on the testament of veterans 100 years after, because he may well have taken photographs at the Boulogne conference, but actually we were able to work out that these ones that he gave me weren't. They're actually from a different date in history, the 5th of April, but nevertheless, they're fascinating stuff. A number of the guys we can identify, including that general there you can see stood up. That's General George Henry Folk. Folkes was a Royal Engineer. He'd served in the Boer War, mentioned dispatches in the defense of Ladysmith. He'd been an observer in the Russo-Japanese War, where he'd also taught entrenching and how to construct fortifications out there as well. In 1914 with the BEF, he was the Brigadier General in charge of Royal Engineers, the most senior engineer in France for the BEF when they went across. He was also the man that got together with John Norton Griffiths when Norton Griffiths came up with a plan, and was one of those that agreed the formation of the tunnelling company. So quite an influential character. By 1917, he took over the job of Adjutant General for the BEF, which he remained in for the continuation of the war. And his face looked familiar, so looked into him, compared him to others, and that's who that chap is. But more interestingly, I was fascinated. If you look in the background there, there's a very smart young officer in his sort of camel coat. And you can see he's having a piece of paper stamped, bang, like this, you see. And this is that moment in time that captivated me when we take it right down to a microcosm, because that's his sort of leave pass. He's on his way home, being stamped by the official before he goes up that ramp and up onto the ship. And thankfully for us, in doing so, what he's done is put his briefcase down. And so I was able to, in fact, you'll find out quite ironically, he fails his own tests. I was able to zoom in on that briefcase, turn it upside down, and his name's on there. So we know that's actually a young second lieutenant called Charles Frank Bernard Force, who was part of the censorship staff of Haig's command. I doubt he would ever expect nearly 500 people to be considering his name a century after the event. But there you are. That's the wonder of modern technology. Here are the two photographs that he certainly said this was the Boulogne conference. Now, it is clearly Boulogne. This is the railway side in there. And you can see behind that station building, which was there until fairly recently, actually. Saw some action, I believe, in 1940. Was full of a load of wounded guardsmen on the retirement or part of the Calais-Boulogne perimeter, and they fight a little action there. But look at that wonderful photograph. And we've got two in quick succession. And the bits I want to point out to you, and I can use my arrow here because I think you can share my screen. See these guys here, look, typical, probably a signaller like myself, cap on the back of his head, hands in pockets, looking very relaxed. Here are the French Guard of Honor getting ready, lined up. There are the band waiting to strike up. And there's a load of Tommies there sat on the roof saying, what's going on here then? Let's get a view of this. So that's the first photograph. Then just moments later, here come the main contingent of officers. There's Haig at the front, you can see. The band has struck up. They're looking, standing to attention, as you can see. The guard is almost in the position waiting to present arms as we get level. But interestingly, the signaller has been hoiked off. Someone said, oi, we don't want you in the way, get out. But a couple of wonderful photographs. We know it's the 19th, we know it's the 9th of April, or 5th of April, sorry, 1919. And we know that because the last two photographs in here are these photographs, and I think they're very symbolic, and one that I wanted to show in particular, because here you can see this is Dorothy Haig, and so she's on the boat, and from that we know that she came across in April 1919 on the occasion that Douglas Haig is leaving the Western Front and going home for good. So this is him on his way home. Look at these wonderful two sailors here looking at each other, one of them saying to the other, oh, I recognise that bloke, out, you know, he's in the papers, isn't he? You know, oh, blimey, this is a job we've got. That must be Dorothy Haig's lady in waiting, I guess, standing with him. And this is the moment as the ship sails away, you can see his staff officers waving goodbye to Douglas Haig. The war's over and he's on his way back. So to kind of finish up with, really, before we get into some questions, and I hope there are a few, what I've done is I've looked at today's modern army doctrine about what makes a modern general. And I just want you to consider these facts. I'll go through them one by one, and we'll just see whether any of what I've shown you over the last hour or so are relevant to that. Firstly, it's very important for modern generals to operate. And by meaning this, we mean that do you analyze both your allies and your enemy's capabilities? It's quite straightforward. You think every general should do that? Well, I think that Haig showed that he was doing that. He was keen to find out what the Germans were up to, and he was very keen to know what his own capabilities are. Command. Well, in this case, he doesn't sit in a chateau waiting for people to come and see him. If we were to follow this on in the following year, you'll see that he spends most of his time in a railway siding. In fact, on the Armistice Day, he's in a little railway siding just outside of Cambrai, a place called Iwuy, where you know, he's sat there in his carriage when news come through the armistice has been signed. No chateau at all there, because he needs to be in a position where he can go and see them. They haven't got enough time. So frequent visits to Corps divisional headquarters, I think, gives him situational awareness and shows his level of command. Is he able to inform through peer-to-peer relationships? I think so. The way he, rather than tell Gough what he's going to do, almost influences Gough about calling off some of those smaller attacks there when he meets them. Prepare. In both battles, when we consider them, Messines, Third Ypres, we can see that he's very keen to use agile forces and use some of the more modern technology that's coming on. He gets a grasp of modern technology. You've got to remember that Ludendorff's opponent here doesn't actually see a tank until February of 1918, which is quite a time after they first come on the battlefield. Whereas Haig is very keen to see what the latest tactical and technological advances are and see whether that he agrees with them, what their uses are. Is he able to project his forces forward? Well, he was keen to use naval assets, so he does kind of look at a more unconventional approach sometimes. That's a good way of doing it. And we see that to project his forces, he was looking at the heavy artillery being moved by narrow gauge railway. So he was open to new ideas like that. Can he protect his forces? Well, yes, he can. He tries to protect them as best he can. He shares concerns with his officers, and he has that intervention about, do we need more air power to protect our troops? And finally, is he able to sustain the battle? And in this case, by looking at the visits to the quarries, assisting with the logistics where possible, we show that all of those things are in his armory. So at that point, I think I'll invite you back in, Simon, because that pretty much sums up what I'm going to say tonight.
Brilliant. Thank you, Clive. Thanks for a great talk. Some fabulous photographs in there, I must say. Can I ask people just to raise their hands by way of appreciation for Clive, please? I don't know if you can see on your screen, but we've got hundreds of hands going up. If you could put them down. So the first person I'm going to call on is Ted Cooper, who was the first one to ask a question.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I got a more focused issue, quite pertinent to our family. My grandfather was involved in the earlier phase of Third Ypres, and he set off middle of August 1917 towards the village of Langemarck.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
And having researched that specific action and what led up to that, I was rather surprised that the weather influence was so enormous, and the impact was, together with the shelling and the rain, huge quagmire areas that we were sending our troops through. So I got this basic question: did Haig actually understand? I know I'm talking a month earlier.
Yeah.
But did Haig really understand what he was doing with our troops? And was it just the need for constant action to tie the Germans down? Was he happy to lose so many people with so few gains?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I'm certainly not in any case going to start justifying the casualty levels that we suffer in 1917. As you know, in the Ypres salient, the water table so high that adds to it as well. That said, Haig was almost, I would say, that's where he wanted most offences to be. He felt that that was a better option for an offensive rather than down on the Somme. He would have fought the Somme campaign up there if he'd had the opportunity to do so. And that was because of its close proximity to the coast and the power of the Royal Navy, that they might be able to use that naval ability to land troops round the back and cut the Germans off. With regards to that weather, one of the things with all technology, as we're learning on Zoom calls tonight when my PowerPoint doesn't work, is even when we practice it 4 or 5 times a day, when you get down to it, it's not the case. Now, it doesn't justify it, but I would say is the technology of that artillery was so effective that it creates that quagmire that the troops that are going across into the attack. And in August, I'm guessing your relative is with either the light division or the 36th Ulster division fighting around that Langemarck, or 29th division that are fighting around there at the time. It just becomes a sea, a bath. And I think one of the things he does realise is that where he finds himself in September, we can't stop there, because if we stop, we are going to continue to lose those casualties in that quagmire with the Germans still on the high ground. So it's not just the case we go on regardless of casualties. We go on because we're probably going to suffer those casualties as we stay where we are. I'd argue that actually we shouldn't have gone any further after the 4th of October. That really marks the watershed for the Ypres salient. Anything after that, I think Haig is misjudged in continuing the offensive. But when he says, look, these small scale actions, what are we doing? Are they really part of it? I think it shows an awareness, Ted, that he understands that we are losing life, but not necessarily the operational gains that are required. Usually they're down at a lower tactical level to capture a farm here and a farm there, and are they really worth it?
Thank you. Thanks for your question, Ted.
Right.
Next one up is David Muir, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much. A very fascinating talk, and very interesting that you picked out Haig as a modern general, very much in the John Terraine mode from Smoke and Fire. My question is, it's obviously a very interesting and busy period for Haig, but when you look at 1918, you've got three effectively very different sections of the year. Right at the beginning, the reorganization of the BEF and his staff, followed on by the German offensive, and then the 100 Days. Very crude division, but how would this period compare with that period?
That's a very good question, actually, and I think we certainly, I've been taught to look at the war almost as year blocks. Even though it's one continual story, the story of 1917 is very different to 1918. It almost feels that it almost, in a very simplistic way, which is probably all we've got time for to debate like that. 1914 is one of optimism, and we're going to go in and get the job done. 1915 is kind of that realization that this is for the long haul and trying to adapt to it. By 1916, we're seeing some of the tactical innovations coming from Verdun and certainly out of the Somme that put us in a good position to be in 1917, but actually the technology lumps forward so quickly that actually negates some of the tactics. And it's not until we get to 1918, the real difference, I think, is the logistical capability and actually the understanding of how to use those tactics and the technology. It's taken that time to learn it. It's not like, this is a good idea, let's do it, it's going to work. In the same way that if I gave this talk again to you next week, the PowerPoint would work and it'd all be a lot happier for all of us. So they're very different phases, and Haig, I think, has to adapt throughout those phases. But one of the things I wanted to get across tonight is, what would it have been like to be in his shoes with the pressure that he's got, not only from people fighting, up at Langemarck in August, like Ted's relative, but also because, there are people looking over your shoulder that are waiting to stick the knife in or whatever. And now you're getting the full support from back home. So there's a lot of stuff. I wanted just to get what was going on in that man's head. There was an awful lot for him to be considering at the time.
David, thanks for your question. Great. Next up, Glyn Taylor, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, please.
Yeah, Clive, thanks again for interesting presentation. My interest is in the link between the decisions at the Boulogne conference and what happened in March 1918. Yeah. And I wonder if you knew when the decision was made to extend the line south of the Oise River, as opposed to trying to rest the flank of the British Army on the Oise River, which to me, having a sort of a water obstacle, would have been a much better place to separate the British from the French. And I haven't quite tracked yet where that decision was made.
Yeah, what is it? Because I think they tended to think a page ahead. So I think you're exactly right. From a defensive perspective, having a river on your flank to protect you would make common sense. Are they now considering the involvement of the US, the numerical differences that's going to make, and the fact that they are actually going to have to advance at some stage and come up in front of the Hindenburg line again? And what they wouldn't want to do is start that offensive by crossing a river. Maybe, I don't know. It certainly would have made things a lot easier in the March of 1918, certainly for the Fifth Army, who have get the poor lot of it, the ground that they take over near Saint-Quentin, which was in no position to defend whatsoever. Hopefully you agree with that.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Clive. I think I need to do a bit more digging.
Great, thanks, Lynn.
We will never get to the bottom of the Great War. So it's hundreds of years yet, believe me.
Yeah. Okay, next up, we've got Thomas Smith, please.
Hi, Thomas.
Hi, Clive. Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. Clive, how would you assess Haig's relationship with General Plumer during the month of September? And I suppose within that, is it right that Haig somehow resented the successes that Plumer had, particularly with his new tactic of bite and hold?
Yeah, I would certainly have my issues with that tactical bite and hold, because I'm a Gallipoli man. So I can see that the Royal Naval Division are the ones that start to innovate bite and hold at Crafia in 1915. And there are a number of Royal Naval Division staff on Pluma staff that actually probably implement it out there. But, we shouldn't get hung up about who invents what. I think that Haig was at times intimidated, not so much by Pluma, but actually by Pluma's chief of staff, who was quite brilliant, right? Was it Harrington, I think, was it? So Pluma's chief of staff, between them, they're quite a dynamic duo. And also, I think that in sometimes Haig, towards the end of the Ypsilon, almost feels that little bit more paternal loyalty, not paternal, he's younger, to Gough. So I think sometimes you can see that he favours Gough in some of his approaches towards Gough, and is a little bit more critical of Pluma. I think it's fair to say that history has dealt a good hand to General Pluma, and largely we remember him as being a very, very efficient general. And I think a lot of that may be around the Messines offensive, which, as far as the Western Front goes, I think is quite brilliant. Yeah, quite brilliant. So I think he's suspicious of. I don't think he's after his job or anything. I think Pluma's probably at his level then. Yeah, I don't know. Are you studying him in particular? It sounds like an MA thesis or something.
No. I mean, I've read just quite a lot about the interplay, particularly because Haig seemed to have favoured Gough.
Yeah.
And then Pluma is very much his own man, and there was also that connection that Pluma had with his men.
Yeah.
But no, I'm not studying their men, but I'd love to.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, that interplay. And one of the things I would like, if I ever got the time to write it, is a study of Douglas Haig called Our Chief. And actually all of my sources, rather than using what he writes about himself, is just simply look about what everyone else writes about him in their papers. And it would give us another layer of his personality and how he was regarded. Might shed some light on those relationships from the other way around. So thanks, that's a very good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive.
Thanks, Thomas. Okay, John Casey, next, if you'd like to unmute.
Hi, Clive. John, how are you, mate? All right.
Fine, thanks. I was thinking about how a lot of the problems that the Germans had with their spring offensive in 18 was Ludendorff's attempt to micromanage everything.
Yeah.
And how effective do you think Haig was at delegating responsibility in an appropriate way to his army commanders?
That's a great question. And I think it's a lose-lose for him when we look back on him, because when he does micromanage, we'll accuse him of micromanaging. And when he doesn't, we'll accuse him of not doing it enough. I think at that level, we can see a bit of micromanagement. I mean, the fact that he's gone to visit army commanders and speak to them, rather than just fire off an order, which other commanders done in history, and say, look, do this. I'm telling you to do it. He turns up in a car. He clearly has a presence when he walks in a room. And he tends, my perception of that is, we'll go back to that Gough talking about how to stop those small scale attacks taken away from the main effort. It almost seems like he's trying to influence him, as opposed to just say, this is what you're going to do. And I think he does the same with on the Somme, doesn't he, when he sort of takes Rawlinson for a sort of a walk at some stage and says, how do you feel this is going? So he will give them enough rope to hang themselves, awful turn of phrase. But I think he gets it about right, micromanaging. What do you feel, John? I mean, we were on
I think he gets it right towards the end.
Yeah.
It's like everything else in the First World War. It's something you had to learn. Yeah.
We'd like them to have learned a lot quicker, wouldn't we? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, cheers, Clive.
Cheers, mate.
Thanks, John. Next up, Richard Owen.
Clive, thank you for a wonderful lecture. Mine's more of a sort of political question, really. It's several of the British High Command spoke fluent French.
Yeah.
Did they have an undue influence on the French allies?
What Henry Wilson are we talking about? I think is one of the
John French himself, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think it would hugely beneficial if you're able to speak the language of one of your allies. Certainly, in what we're effectively looking at is a large coalition war. I think Haig spoke enough French. I don't think he was fluent in it, but he'd probably be able to engage in polite conversation. Of course, I think I'm going to really risk upsetting anyone under the age of sort of 70 now, but I think they're probably education in those days. People were able to speak French coming out of that English public school society than we do now. I think it would be a great benefit to them, and I certainly think Wilson himself does influence a lot of the opinions of Haig with regards to the way he speaks to Foch. They're able to have conversations in, as you know, in perfect French, and a lot of those discussions are had when Haig's not around. Maybe that's one of the reasons he wasn't sent to the Boulogne conference.
Well, that's my question.
Yeah, maybe his French wasn't quite good enough for that, but you'd have thought a man in his position would have a good team of interpreters working along with him. The Leeds United manager gets away with it okay, doesn't he?
Well, foreign managers speak better English than our managers.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. Linda Jansen.
Hello, Clive, your favorite American scalyback.
Yeah, it's good to hear another signaler. Happy Thanksgiving if it's still going on and that sort of stuff.
Thank you very much. It was great. So my mom has discovered another uncle who was killed at Cambrai.
Yeah.
So I assume here in this period that you're talking about, the planning was ongoing. So I just wonder if you could talk about the use of technology in combined arms at Cambrai and how Haig kind of fit this battle, Cambrai, into the larger context here.
Yeah, well,
was it just an experiment with new technologies, or?
Well, I think you're getting along the right lines there. As you know, the tank in particular probably doesn't have its finest moment there at Passchendaele because of the conditions and the terrain. Albeit the first Victoria Cross is awarded, isn't it, to Clement Robinson in September. But they felt that the Cambrai battlefield offered them the best opportunity to exploit this new weapon as a tank. It was going to be like a reconnaissance raid in force, if you like. And the error in judgment we have is that once we decide to launch the Cambrai raid, in part to take pressure away from what was happening on the Italian front, people start to add bits onto it. Linda, you know, say, oh, while we're there, can we do this? Can we do that? And as you know, being a competent staff officer yourself, any plan, once you start to expand it, you really need to rip it up and start again. Because if you add bits on, what you do is you widen that margin for error, and it's not going to end well. And that's effectively what occurs at Cambrai, especially given that Haig's reserve troops that he would have used for Cambrai, had there been the breakthrough, were exactly the divisions that had been sent down to Italy. And there's an incredible moment in his command. We must go there one day on one of our tours, but when we head down towards Boulogne Wood, just on the edge of Flesquières, there's a moment where Haig rides forward in the driving rain on his horse, looking into the wood, and they're saying, do we go on? Do we go on? And of course, he's there. This is the loneliness of command. He knows that if we go on, he's not really got the reserves to see it through. And loads of telegrams are going to arrive through doorsteps back home. And if we don't go on, the same's going to happen anyway because of the German counterattack. And, you know, people are almost harrying him on for an answer, and he's got that on his leadership, you know, all that decision making on his shoulders. So let's convince the Kansas City guys to go and look at Cambrai. It'd be great.
Thanks, Linda. Thank you very much. Chris Weeks, over to you.
Hi, Clive.
Well, and even more exotic, we're now heading to someone from Essex, so that's fantastic.
Oh, yes, well, it's tropical here. Anyway, brilliant presentation as usual, so thanks very much. I've always been fascinated about the sending troops to Italy in November 1917, so that was a real revelation about the thing about the French. So my question is do you think that the troops that were sent off to Italy made a real difference to the outcome of the Italian campaign? Or do you think that had Haig had them, he would have been able to have made better use of them on the Western Front?
Wow, that's a real low baller for me, isn't it? Really, to answer that one point.
Full toss.
Absolutely. Well, I would say that they probably, they could have made a difference at Cambrai. They could have made it. There's quite a few divisions there, and some of them are pretty good divisions as well. Did they make a difference in Italy? Well, the Asiago plateau, it costs Fanshawe his job, of course. He loses his job as a result of the fighting at Asiago. They would argue, the men that went to Italy, that they were the only soldiers that had been part of the British Expeditionary Force in mainland Europe that end up on enemy territory on the 11th of November once they cross into Austria, right? So the technology and the tactical advances in Italy by the troops that are there are quite impressive. And actually, I think someone did a doctorate, didn't they, on seeing whether those ideas transferred across to the Western Front and how quickly they transferred across. Did they make a difference? Yeah, I think they did. They did make a difference in Italy. They shored up that area. They stopped the Austrian offensive, really, and then they were in a good position to cross the river and get them on a forward foot again. So yeah, I'm going to be generous and say they made a difference in Italy, and they could have made a difference at Cambrai.
Great. Same thing.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Go away
Chris.
with that one.
Michael Phipps, if you're ready.
Hi, Clive. Talk about
Hi, Mike.
exotic locations. I'm up in God's own country.
Southeast London. You've got a great accent.
No, the other one. Listen, it's great to hear you talk. Fantastic enthusiasm and passion, and your knowledge is amazing. I've got a simple question, really. What did Haig consider to be his greatest success? Was it a battle or a particular event? Do we know?
I think it's going to be after the war. I think it's the big political battle. I touched on there. He was quite good at negotiating. I mentioned he could have been in the civil service. I think his biggest political battle he has is when he manages to somehow get the umbrella of warring factions of ex-servicemen under the one roof of the British Legion, along with God, you've got me on the Western Front now. So Ian Hamilton, who's also involved in it as well. So I think some of Haig's, he would personally say his best attributes is how he dug in and tried to stand up for the veterans at the end of the war, which is why they remembered him in the way they did, in stark contrast to the way that we kind of remembered him from maybe 1930s through to the 1970s, when John Train started to gain a bit of traction for a reappraisal.
Thanks, Michael. Gordon Holmes.
Hello, Clive.
Hello, mate.
Nice to see you. Fascinating insight into the great man. My question is regarding Lloyd George. The war sometimes seemed to take second place to his political power play. Between himself and his political opponents, and his ambition to use Haig as a puppet, or even colour his thinking tactically to reduce the butcher's bill in some ways.
Yeah.
Did he have a lot of sway with Haig? Did he try to make him toe the line?
I think he made his mind up fairly early on that he didn't see Haig as the real future of it. And I think in some ways this goes back to those early arguments about Easterners and Westerner. I have to be careful on this, because if I had one more day on a battlefield, it would be in Gallipoli. You know, Gallipoli is my real genuine passion. Mm-hmm. But I do understand, despite that the war can only be won against the main enemy on the main battlefield, which is the Western Front. Yeah. Okay. But I can see the attractions after the stalemate of the Western Front to try things elsewhere. The irony, I think, with Lloyd George, if you see the end of his political career when he eventually costs him his job, it's because, in part, of questions that are asked in the House after an uprising in Çanakkale, which is under British rule. And we lose around about 60, 70 servicemen killed in civil disturbances in the Dardanelles Straits. And that's eventually Gallipoli comes to haunt him on the backside. Now, Gordon, we could argue forever about the merits of Gallipoli, and I'm a big one for saying that the Dardanelles were in the top 3 most strategic waterways in the world then, and is in the top 3 most strategic waterways now, which is why it's so important for Russia, for Turkey, for all of this, for, you know, why Syed got that big Russian naval base just off the coast of Syria, because without it, they've got to use the Dardanelles.
Yeah.
So what I won't ever have is anyone say, "Oh, the Gallipoli was just a sideshow." Winston Churchill.
Oh no, there were so many.
A lot bigger than that, but given the enormity and the significance of the Western Front, that's where we need to go. And I think that always grated at Lloyd George when it came to his decision making. So yeah, he made things quite difficult at times.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't always agree with what Haig did. He often went against him and often tried to colour his thinking.
Yeah, well, and arranged conferences and didn't invite him. So
well, that's what led to my question initially.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Clive, and a fascinating lecture. Thank you.
That's no problem.
Gordon, thank you very much. So let's go to Dick Richards for the last question.
Clive, thank you very much. Really enjoyed that talk. Modern day management theory and leadership theory talks about the right balance between work and life.
Yeah.
Do we know what Haig did to relax in terms of hobbies, pastimes, or was it all work and no play?
Well, he actually, I mean, fitness was still an issue for him. So he would tend to, rather than be driven everywhere, if possible, he would take to ride out on his visits in the morning and then be picked up by a car so his groom got back. That gave him that chance to clear his head, no doubt, because when you're on your horse, you're pretty much on your own. He was very strict about when he went to bed and when he would be knocked on, you know, to be woken up the next morning. So that would be his time. And also he was a man of faith. You know, I'm not going to question anyone's individual faiths. It was when I first started being interested in the First World War as a teenager, in great detail, and like most of us on the journey, I was initially very critical of the High Command because I couldn't get beyond the casualty figures. And I can remember for a while wrestling with, did I want Haig taking time with his Church of Scotland minister looking for divine intervention, or did I want him studying a trench map? And this was a time when I was a young soldier myself, so I went down the trench map view. But you know, looking back on it, it's hard to say how much comfort that Haig may have felt in his own religion, and so spending that time with his Church of Scotland minister may have been his downtime, along with sometimes teasing visiting guests. There's that wonderful story, isn't there, where I think it's Lloyd George comes to have dinner with them, and they're sat there, and he's got a bottle of Napoleon brandy, and he pours the brandy, and they drink it, and he sits having a chat, and Lloyd George starts to move his glass towards the brandy by way of hint, and Haig ignores it deliberately. And after dinner, Starkidgel says to him something like, God, the Prime Minister was after another brandy there. And he said, God damn it, if the Prime Minister hasn't got the balls to ask for another brandy, I'm not going to dish it up for him. So I think there was a side to him as well that we don't often see. Quite a character.
Thank you, Clive.
Thank you.
Brilliant, brilliant. Clive, what can I say? That was a very informative, very entertaining talk. Can I ask everyone again, please, to raise your hands just by way of a silent thanks? And for those of you who haven't already booked, can I just point out that Clive is going to be one of the battlefield guides on the Western Front virtual battlefield tours in January, February, and March. So if you haven't already investigated and booked, do so, because there are a few places left. Thanks ever so much again, Clive. Just to let you know, there's more coming up from the Western Front. On Friday, we've got another of Andy Thompson's Big Night quizzes. Details on the website if you want to register and take part in the quiz. This is the third one. Apparently the first two have gone down really well. And then on Monday, we're back with another webinar where we've got Spencer Jones talking about the Battle of Loos, and in particular the 28th Division and the battle for the Hohenzollern Redoubt. So come along and join us on that. All that remains is to thank you once again, Clive, and thank everyone for joining us. So for now, that is it. So good night to everyone.
Cheerio.
Thanks a lot, Clive. Take care, mate.
Bye.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Inky, pinky, parlez-vous. Hearts are kicking, Armentiers,